Good morning.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Exactly, as depending on where everyone is. And welcome to the RockCreek at COP26. For the next 2 weeks, we'll be talking to leading investors, like this morning with Divya, with expert scientists and climate experts, and try to unpack what's going on at COP26 over this week and next week. While it's great to see action, I think people like Divya and myself who've been involved in this dialogue for a long time find that we could go even faster. But today I wanted to talk specifically with Divya Seshamani. She is one of the world's top investors in sustainability. She invests across the board on climate-related investments, in projects in renewable energy, resilient infrastructure, in water resources, and energy efficiency. She also worked at TPG. Prior to that, she was a partner at TPG. She has worked at Goldman Sachs and a number of other places, but also she has been involved with Chatham House. She's been a global leader at the World Economic Forum and been involved in really the dialogue on climate for a very, very long time, which is why we thought, given her work, but also her involvement with COP26, it would be great to have a conversation this morning. Thank you so much, Divya, with your very busy schedule, to speak with us today.
No worries, always a pleasure, Afsaneh.
Divya, I was wondering, what is the mood, as you're observing it at Glasgow?
So it's a strange one because there have been 25 other COPs. So you start to wonder what these are trying to achieve, right? And I've been at some and not at others. And I think the one thing that is very clear, I think as an investor community, we are at a crossroads. So we have been looking, the ones who have been investing in for a long time, we're asking ourselves, how do we look at the results of COP? So China's not there. India has delayed a contribution to it. America is not going nearly fast enough. And so you then have to be very, very clear-eyed about whether this is we are going to have a 3-degree rise in temperature. And I think the answer is yes. So I'm not one for pessimism or optimism. I like to try and make sure we deliver clear-eyed reality for investors, because that's the only way you assess risk properly. And I think we've always been backward looking. So if you start 10 years ago when we started fundraising in this space, people didn't understand incorporating climate as risk. I think people understand that now, but then we need to ask ourselves, what climate are we climate are we incorporating? What risk are we incorporating? If we're doing sort of a hopeful picture where everyone plays ball and Paris is adhered to and we manage to keep the degree change, then great. I just don't think that's what the data is showing us. What the data is showing us is that we are going to have probably the full temperature rise. The data is showing us that the expansion of variable climate has already happened. So where averages no longer apply, variability is increased already, and that variability is going to continue. And so we need to be really focusing, not backward looking as an investor group on just pure emissions, which I think is destructive and can lead to some really adverse outcomes because we're, with the creative accounting, but to really look forward looking and focus on resilience and adaptation. If people are not going to play ball, as investors, we have to do our fiduciary duty.
That's a really important point that you're making in terms of, as you're looking again today, what are some examples of what can we do on resilience and on adaptation that you think could be interesting, and in terms of returns would be sort of at the top of the chain?
We are focusing at Greensphere on the technology. So, $1 trillion in natural capital is going to have to be put in the ground, and we were finding there was very little science behind it. So we are looking at technology on the kind of higher risk spectrum of things, more venture capital into the science and scaling up the science for creating this natural capital, whether it's flood defenses or water treatment. Green infrastructure will increasingly play, I think, a bigger role in both governments and countries' responses to resilience. And on the other spectrum, in terms of real assets, I would look at individual companies, so industrial companies, and really look at how they are going to be responding, whether it's supply chain resilience or energy resilience, because we often think about this. When we look at climate change, I often see some people say, well, I invest in the biomass sector. And I say, okay, let's unpeel that a little bit. If your biomass is grown in Brazil and 70% of your input cost is oil, you don't own a green infrastructure asset, you own a fossil fuel asset. And so that is how you need to think about it. Look at the underlying risks and look at where, we follow three big systemic risks: supply chain, so resource scarcity, climate stress. I say climate stress because it's how we build. So whether we're looking for flood defenses, we do report emissions data because our investors want us to, but it's almost a red herring. You need to be looking at the underlying risk. And the third risk is input volatility. So how inputs create a cost of capital for the types of companies you're investing in. It's the fact that's not the fact that oil prices are high or low, or gas prices are high or low. It's the fact that they go all over the place. And as we know, that creates very wildly differing cash flows, and that's not something you can account for without really looking at the underlying risks in your supply chain. So that's kind of what I would say. I'd say really focus on true risk. A TCFD, for example, is a great framework for that. And Mark Carney has done a great job in really trying to flesh that out. But I think too many people are focused on the box ticking of emissions and not enough on the underlying risk.
I think that's such a good point, Divya. But at the same time, the measurement, there are no standards, right, for measurements often.
No.
For a lot of, if you want to go all the way down the chain. So sometimes what worries me is, to what extent can we do what you're saying in terms of looking at the whole supply chain? To what extent do we want to make sure people don't use that as an excuse, therefore not to do anything? How do you balance that in the work you do?
So I often say, some people say, people do say, so let's pick that apart. I think there's a first aspect, which is how can you measure? And I think if you go to someone, someone was CEO of Unilever or any of these large companies, they will know what keeps them up at night.
Right.
They should know. And if they don't know, then they're not doing a good job as a board, as a CEO, right? There are underlying risks, both in climate, either whether it's climate risk directly in terms of availability of their product, or how climate can affect installations, facilities, etc. Whether they are fit for purpose in a world with greater variance. We then look at the other thing, which is energy security, for example. That's a really good one, because you can do renewables because you feel like it's a good thing to do, right? Reduce emissions. But without a carbon price today, there's some ETS liabilities that companies have in the UK, but in general, if you're a company in China, you will not have a carbon price imputed. And so if you don't have that carbon price, then it is almost a very ethereal thing to say, I'm going to reduce my emissions, because it's a free good, right? It's the law of the commons. So what we would say to that is look at your underlying risk. Now, if you are today, I don't want to look backward, but today investing in renewables is the best thing you can do because it secures your energy price. If you are a company in the UK, even without your ETS liability, facing ridiculous gas price costs for kilns, for firing your steel factories, if you had hedged and bought private wire, or if you'd put in a price, you'd be quids in today with the cost of. So energy security is something that people need to think about, and actually renewables is one of the lowest cost energy sources out there. So you should be doing it because it's low cost. China's going to be moving to renewables because it's the lower cost option, not really because it's green. I think in terms of resilience and climate, we really need to be thinking about, again, how resilient are our supply chains? How resilient are our manufacturing facilities? And I don't think people are thinking that way yet. I think people are still doing this. Okay, I've just bought from a biomass facility, therefore I'm okay, I'm green. And the perverse issue is there's so many accounting irregularities, as you said, between scope 1, 2, 3, and how it's accounted for today.
You're so right. And the regulators in the UK versus the US are all versus the rest of Europe versus rest of the world are coming up with different rules that don't help us. I was curious, Divya, as you see in the UK, do you see, apart from insurance companies, anybody else using a carbon implicit tax, as if we're going to have one, or carbon price, I should say? I know some of the, you worked with some of the biggest investors in Singapore. I think some of them are using like a $35 to $40 kind of implicit price. Do you see anybody else doing that?
Well, there is anyway through ETS in the UK. So we have a liability anyway for some companies. The perverse issue is, and with some other companies, high energy users, they don't have that ETS. They are kind of carved out. So, and it's, it's a constant bartering. Oh, we have such a terrible high cost because we've got green levies. And the reality is they should be securing, proper energy supplies for them. They're socializing the problem because they are in large, quite hard to fail industries. And we really need as a society to be asking, are they the right producers? Is it the right management? Why aren't you thinking about your supply chain risk properly, right? And that I think is a real problem. I think the UK has made remarkable strides to net zero. I've been working through the CSB. In my role, we have this net zero dashboard. Yes. And we have a very high rate of pledges, both in Footsie 100, Footsie 250. The thing that's really interesting now is getting to the granular level of how that marathon is going to be run. So we have asked them in a very non-judgmental way, and this is my pro bono role, not my day job, where we work with large, so we only have C-level, CEO level participants, some of the largest companies. We have organized them by sector groups. And what we're planning to do with each of these roundtables, whether it's commercial real estate or building and construction, is 10 to 15 CEOs of the largest companies in the UK discussing their climate journey in granular detail. So we've got them to say, where are you now? What's your pledge? How long are you going to take? That's the easy bit. We then get them to do the second level, which is how much of that is an easy win in your eyes? How much of that is programmatic change? So you're going to have to put resource behind it. And how much of it is innovation-led? And by sector, we aggregate it and feed it back to them. And it's remarkable. Some sectors, almost all of it is innovation-led.
Right.
They're waiting for the silver bullet to turn up, and in others, they're getting on with it by true programmatic change. We're then marrying them up with policy leads in each sector so that in government, so they can unblock these things. And so what we're doing is really tackling it at a granular level because that's what's needed now.
So you have this role, you're appointed by the Secretary of State to Her Majesty's Government Council of Sustainable Business, which you're talking about, where you're leading this net zero carbon initiative. So in the role you were just describing, are there some specific things? Let's take real estate. Let's take any sector that you were talking about. Like, what would be the 3 things that you would advise them to do, or you think they're doing?
The whole point of doing it by sector and getting CEO level involvement and really telling us what they've been reporting to their boards is precisely this. There isn't a silver bullet, right? So if I said tomorrow, one thing that always comes up is, can we have a carbon price, right? That's an easier way to measure it. And the ones with ETS liabilities, that's very, very front and center at the moment. Mm-hmm. But if you then had to go underneath, you start to see how, when you ask them to just do the simple exercise, easy wins, programmatic change, innovation, it's amazing what comes up. So within commercial real estate, one guy will say, I'm going to swap out all my LEDs. That's an easy win. Another guy is cash strapped, has capital constraints, has a board that's not receptive, and he's categorized it as a programmatic change over 8 years. And so you start to see how the capital constraints and the structures of different companies prevent them from doing certain things. I think what we are trying to do is this benchmarking, quasi-benchmarking exercise allows them to see where the aspiration in their sectors lie. But I think from an investor perspective, we should be looking at trying to do that with all of the companies we invest in. because we need to be pushing them to say, what is the underlying risk? And one thing I would say you shouldn't do, I think there are lots of things you could do because it's variable, is allow them to get away on offset. Right. Because when you are offsetting, you are not tackling the underlying risk of the business and how it's exposed to climate change. It's great that you're doing the offset. I think if companies do that and as an interim measure, as they progress to net zero, that's fine. But if offset is the primary driver of how they are getting to net zero, you need to ask yourself whether you are truly investing in a resilient business.
I think that is so true. I think in another conversation you and I were having, it's kind of interesting, even for oil companies right now, there's some investors who are arguing for them to separate their two parts, the renewable part, the non-renewable part, but the non-renewable part goes on. It just goes on under different ownership. Correct. So net, we are in the same place we were before. And
or worse, right? They're pumping out more oil than they ever have before.
Exactly right, because the new owners might have very different governance and very different boards. You, in fact, are also on some Footsie 250 boards. How do you find that role? Is it more complicated? Is it somewhere where you're feeling there's more constructive discussion around the topic?
It is a very, very strong. Look, you can't have someone who's leading kind of net zero initiative on your board and not like vaguely take it seriously. Right. So fortunately, I'm on the board of Forterra. They are taking it very seriously. We've made significant inroads on sustainability, and I'm very fortunate to have a very receptive board, and a board that really does want to focus on the underlying risk and has understood TCFD. I think there are other boards I'm exposed to through my pro bono role where it's still a very much a box ticking exercise. How do we make sure that the rating agencies give us that good rating? You know, how do we talk about offsets more? How many trees can we put in our new annual report without addressing significant underlying risk? And I think that is the one thing I will keep cautioning over and over again, is when you're not looking at underlying risk, you're basically operating in a really unsafe environment. Some companies less so than others, right? Some companies are just not exposed as much. But if you're an oil company and you've got all of your refineries in areas where sea levels are rising, you know, oil companies are some of the most exposed entities to climate change in the market at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so risk management, which used to be very narrow, I think is a much broader subject. And as you said, there are layers on top of layers on top of layers, which makes investing, you know, where you are on your day job at Greensphere, where we are at RockCreek, both more interesting, but also more complicated, as you were saying earlier.
Yes.
So can you, I know you had a big announcement yesterday. Is that something you can share with us?
Yeah, so we are announcing, as I said, one of the areas that we are very much worried about is we have so many investors come and say, hey, we want to do natural capital, how do we do it? Right. And the temptation is, well, we'll just buy a forest, right? The problem is if you, like us, believe that we will see a temperature rise, forestry and ag are some of the, so that's what two of our biggest investment areas, forestry and ag, alongside renewables. And they are the most exposed to this huge climatic variance we're going to see. And what we were increasingly feeling was a lot of investment, ag tech investments, forestry investments, real asset investments in this space were going through with no concept of looking at the science. So, you know, you're going to have this temperature rise. What then? If you're going to plant a real asset for 50 years, which is what these forestry assets could be and ag assets, you could end up losing your entire investment as temperature rises and they burn down. Or you plant a monoclonal species, which is the single, you know, a single individual in a whole forest, and it gets, you know, a vector and it gets depleted because of that. So we decided the science hasn't been scaled up enough. And so we are working with Kew Gardens to try and, they have the largest research, they're the kind of largest research base globally in the UK. And we'd love to try and make the UK a center of excellence in this place with our investment. And we are looking to effectively scale up that science and commercialize that science. It's earlier stage than we've done before. We've done some early stage before, but we've decided that this is one where the balance of risk versus return is truly compelling. And so we're really excited about this, and we hope to announce our first few investments soon.
Wonderful. Well, look forward to having a conversation about that. I'm curious, as we're talking about COP26, and you've been taking part in the meetings, what is your sense? Is this methane pledge that we saw, or the deforestation reversals, including Brazil, all, great news? Are those things we should definitely be excited about, or the fact that there was not more substantive agreement on some of the things that we hope to have agreement about? Is that a problem? Also, if you could touch on, you said earlier in the conversation, the fact that China is not present in person, what does that mean to you?
So point by point, methane pledge, definitely positive. We think that there's more methane should be sequestered, more methane should be captured in some ways and used, because this is a fuel more than anything else. You'll know that. We're big investors in anaerobic digestion, so I'm clearly very pro methane. But when it escapes into the air, as people flare it, or cows belch it, or peat bogs release it, the science behind it is there. We're just not applying it, and it's not in policy. So the fact that people are looking at making it into policy is a good thing. And I think a lot of it is non-contentious material. So that's that answer. I think it's a good thing. I think, does it go far enough? Probably not. But I think everyone agrees on it. And I think if we can get to a state very much like they did with the Montreal Protocol with CFCs, I think that would be phenomenal, because as you know, methane as a GHG, people talk about carbon emissions, but these are greenhouse gas emissions, is far more warming than standard carbon dioxide. The second one, which is forestry, I am hopeful, and I say this as someone very heavily involved in the sector and very passionate about it, very hopeful, but very sad, because so much of what is going on is external to existing agreed forestry policies already. There is no social, political acceptance in any of the countries. You go to Brazil and say, hey, should we be chopping down these forests? No one's going to say, yes, let's destroy the Amazon. No one is saying that. But there is a complicit political and tacit agreement closing their eyes to policing it. Now, we can have, so the thing that's missing from what I've seen so far is, how do we police this? And when, very wealthy countries like Canada are still cutting down old growth in some of the most protected areas, it gives me very little hope. A country like Canada has closed its eyes to BC old growth forest being cut down. And so I just wish there was a bit more focus on policing, because so much of what was announced is in policy everywhere. I don't know any country that has a policy of cutting down old growth forests. It's just not policed.
That's interesting. It's interesting. Our friend Patrick Bichette, who is very involved in Canada on actually growing trees, and we should talk to him about this, because he's trying to do exactly the opposite in Canada. So let me ask you my last question, Divya, which is what I've been very curious about is, how did you get into the whole area of renewables, and how did your passion in climate start? What were you doing? Were you a young person? Were you in school? Were you already working? How did you get into what you're doing?
My husband often jokes, I don't know whether he said, if you haven't become a banker, you might have ended up as an eco-terrorist. I don't know if that's a good introduction. So I've always been involved in this. I've always been passionate. I think the reason I was passionate is a little story of a 9-year-old girl who had just moved to Singapore, and I was exposed through an essay writing competition to David Attenborough, who used to come visit Singapore. Wow. And he said at the Mandai Nature Reserve, which is now the Mandai Nature Reserve, the zoo, He said, did you know you live in a country that has more species biodiversity than all of England?
Wow.
And for me, that was a huge fact. Singapore is tiny and it is massively biodiverse. And it just it roped me in. I was hooked. So it started then. I ended up doing a lot of industrials in my early career in private equity. And industrials, as you know, they were gears and chain boxes for wind turbines. That all became very cool. It wasn't as cool, flow control devices. And then doing real assets with GIC. So it's kind of been an evolved position, but I think I took a stake to the ground about 10 years ago when I started Greensphere, because I truly believed that if we were going to succeed as investors, we had to focus on underlying risk and not on the headlines. And as a government, as a fund manager for the UK government, so we won against 23 other fund managers 10 years ago. That's how we've tried to conduct ourselves. We believe we have to focus on underlying risk. And that's my one key message. I keep banging on about it. It seems a really simple thing to do. But when you look at people's investment choices, whether it's repackaging existing investments as and counting their impact and then saying it's good, so kind of impact after the fact, or doing, investing in a biomass plant that imports from Brazil, is cutting down forests there. It makes me think there's a lot of sector investing, headline investing, greenwashing, and not enough focused on risk. And I think truly now, Afsaneh, we are at a crossroads. So there are going to be investors who are backward looking and say, let's mitigate. Let's tick the emissions boxes. And the forward looking investors saying, okay, amplification and variability has happened. We're going to shift. How does this now affect us on a forward-looking basis? And I think the forward-looking has to be the case, whatever you believe.
And I think, Divya, what I have hope in is you and other investors and others who are leaders in this area really making a difference. I think, it used to be that governments and public sector and multilaterals sort of led. And I think what is interesting right now, you have the young population all over the world that is leading, people like yourself, who are the top investors, really showing us that the renewables are the lowest cost option, as you just said earlier. And there is hope for our planet, and look forward to continuing our conversation as the COP26 goes on. And hoping,
could I just leave you with one thing?
Absolutely, please.
There is always hope for our planet. Yes. Our planet will go on. I don't know if there's hope for us as a species, and that is the point. The planet is incredibly resilient in its multitude of operations. But as COVID has shown us, we're fragile. We're far more fragile than the planet is. And we will ruin it. It will, we will face the repercussions of increased variance. We may not survive that. And I think that's something that people are starting to realize. It's the symbiosis there.
That's such a powerful point, Divya. And do you find, as the leaders, are leaving the summit, just as we speak, do you feel they also realize the gravity of what you just said?
I think some of them do. I think if you ask Boris to look deep inside, with UK as less than 0.6% of, or 1% of world emissions, and China not there, and America not going fast enough, and people saying that India with 1/10 of China's or America's per capita emissions have to do something, or they're the savior. It starts to make me think there's no one's really focusing on resilience. And the problem is that some of the developing nations are going to be facing the brunt of it.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about investing, I think certainly the FCDO, if you look at the kind of money that's being targeted, resilience and adaptation is certainly something that the UK is focusing on. I don't think that's necessarily what everyone else is focusing on. People are still quite cynically using it as an export credit mechanism. And it means that people are going to get flooded, moved out of homes, and a mass migration events coming up. And I don't know, I am not a political expert. What I can do is look at my own personal investments here and make sure that we're resilient on that front.
Well, congratulations on everything you're doing. I appreciate your taking the time from your busy schedule to talk to us. And
thank you so much.
Really appreciate the time, Divya.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.